Well, there are about 2 million landlords and 3 million rental properties in Australia, and recent statistics claim as much as 33% of the market is now self-managing. Now, Rent Better is a platform offering landlords a way to run their investment property DIY. Jeremy Goldschmidt is the founder and CEO of Rent Better. He joins us on the program. Thanks for coming on the show, Jeremy.
Thanks very much for having me on, Peter.
So why don't you tell us about where all this came from? We know Australians love property, and lots of Australians have got into being landlords. But where did the idea of Rent Better come from?
Sure. I mean, if I look at my sort of personal background, I actually bought an investment property about 15 years ago. And it was actually at the moment that I sort of took over that property and looked at the sort of management agreement and thought, hang on, I can actually do this. I can save money. I was a busy professional at the time, but having sort of been through the process and doing, if you like, a little bit of research on what was involved, I was pretty confident that I'd be able to handle it myself. And it just so happened that over the time since then, I'd had family and friends and sort of, I guess, associates further out who'd asked, well, you do it yourself. How do you do it? And I found myself writing cheat sheets and guides and explanations. And over time, all of those things seemed to travel quite far and wide until it became very apparent that there was a pretty high demand for this sort of thing, that people actually did want to take control of their investment property and manage it themselves without a third party in the way.
So I guess in many ways, what you're saying is that, like most things, you would have learned on the job that you did actually make mistakes in the early days, but I guess you would have created a system that actually overcame those problems. And in the end, it became a really good working system.
Absolutely right. I mean, there's a series, especially when it comes to managing a property, there's a series of processes that one needs to go through. In building out the Rent Better platform, we've been able to actually automate a lot of those steps. So if you're a landlord and you need to find a tenant, or if you've already got a tenant and you need to manage your property, there are a series of activities and steps and processes that are now built into the platform. So from a landlord's perspective, you can actually take advantage of a sort of well-worn and well-trodden path that's been put into the system and leverages the experiences of thousands of landlords across the country.
Okay, so why don't you explain precisely how the Rent Better platform works? Because people watching this will be thinking, all right, do I have to actually occasionally turn up and all that sort of stuff? So give us an idea of the day-to-day operations and the occasional.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a great question, because you started by suggesting this is on the DIY end of the spectrum, and it absolutely is, but there's a tool and a system that helps you. So as I said, we talk about it in sort of two, if you like, functions. One is to find a tenant, which would mean that if obviously your current tenant is leaving, or perhaps you've just bought the property and you're looking for a tenant, the first thing you do is you're able to go to the Rent Better platform and set up your property and basically create an ad. So uploading photos, writing a description, setting up inspection times. You can then publish those ads onto the major property sites where you'll see obviously thousands of listings. So real estate, domain, rent.com.au. And then you can handle the inquiries and the applications through the Rent Better platform. So it's all automated through the system. If you needed to then assess or basically go through a process of selecting a tenant, you can run tenant checks through Equifax or through the credit bureau. And then finally, once you've decided that you're going to proceed with a specific tenant, you can actually create the lease agreement for that tenancy, send it to the tenant through the platform. They can sign electronically, you can sign electronically, and pretty quickly through a few clicks of a button on a website or through the platform, you're actually securing your tenant. And so that's been something that we get sort of rave reviews about over time, is just how quickly and easily people are able to do that. And then, if you like, is really where the work starts, so to speak, because if you're like, I'm sure most of your audience out there, and you've got an investment property, the return on that investment comes from the rent that you receive. So the really critical next step is, once you've secured a tenant, is going into that management mode. And that's where the platform really delivers a lot of value. So we operate a system that allows you to, number one, set up a payment schedule that's attached to the lease agreement. So let's just say your rent is $500 a week, paid fortnightly over 12 months. That schedule is set up. It automatically will run the payments, track those payments, receipt them. If there's any failed payments, it will actually send out notifications. So it really keeps you on track and keeps everything in one place. And so you've got, I guess, confidence and comfort in that payment process. And then when it comes to all the associated things like tracking expenses, billing the tenant for utilities, and I guess what you'd call the administration side of things, so that at tax time, you've got a report with all your income and your expense tracked. The platform actually gives you all of those features and tools that are associated with it. So again, from a landlord's perspective, as you put it before, there is a DIY element where you're in control and you're monitoring and managing, but the system is driving a lot of the activity to make it more efficient for you.
Yeah. Yeah. How long has the Rent Better platform been operating for?
So we've been going for almost 5 years now. The last sort of 2.5, we've had, I call it real investment, and we've grown quite substantially as a result. But the business itself has been going for close to 5 years now.
Yeah. And so what were the big lessons in the early days, which have now become critically important to make sure that customers that come to your website have a good experience? Because a lot of people would love to think, oh, it's online, I don't have to do anything. And probably in the perfect world, you wanted to create something like that, but experience taught you that there are some things that people are going to have to do to make sure that the whole experience works out.
Absolutely. And look, I think, many of your viewers, again, will have had experiences with Airbnb and Uber and a range of these tech platforms. And the thing that always, I guess, drives value for people is the experience of using it and shortcutting processes that were otherwise quite painful. And the one that always comes to mind with me is, of course, I can just hail a taxi on the street, but you often think about, well, at the end, I'm going to have to pull out my credit card. It's going to be a painful exchange. I don't want to do that. If I just go through Uber, it'll be pretty simple and slick, and I'll feel better about getting in and getting out. And I think it's much the same with a lot of the functionality that we offer. Because often people will find a tenant, let's just say, but there is all this paperwork and there's all this friction in the process of creating, if you like, the necessary steps from I've identified someone to how do I securely and in a compliant way set up my tenancy. So whether it's the lease agreements and having a digital signature on the platform and being able to go from an idea to action, we think those sort of moments in time actually smooth the process and do make it it's not quite easy that you do it with your eyes closed, but it is a process whereby you're in control and you can take the obvious steps that need to happen. So I think one thing from our perspective is if you like, creating the bridge between major steps in any process. If that bridge is really well connected and easier for you to step on and across, then that certainly helps. And we found that around lease agreements, condition reports, and some of these features.
And have you found that, and I'm not sure whether it's necessarily something that you guys recommend, but I would have thought, like in a perfect agent relationship, they do everything, they actually seem to represent you, they also seem to assess the tenant really well, but the flip side, we know most agents, or a lot of agents don't do that. And so you get really disappointed with the money you're paying and the experience you get. Do you recommend, even if the whole process becomes very seamless via Rent Better, that the landlord at least gets to meet the tenant and have some experience so you can actually size up the tenant?
Absolutely. That's something that I think will never go away. And you talked about before some of the sort of time commitments and the things that one needs to do in this process. And we actually produce webinars and a range of content around the best way to do this. But certainly when it comes to, I guess from the tenant's perspective, I don't know about you, but I would be very unlikely to sign a lease agreement without physically seeing the space where I'm going to live. And from the landlord's perspective, again, video calls and phone calls are really helpful, but I do think there's something to be said for actually physically seeing and having sort of, if you like, a judgment call on that person. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to making a decision, one of the heavy criticisms that you will hear from people who use a third party is that if you like, the incentives aren't always aligned, because the third party often gets paid when the rent gets paid. So they're in a hurry to just get anyone in there. And perhaps the judgment call on whether they were the right person is sometimes lacking. And if you're a landlord, you might say to yourself, well, how do I know I've got the right judgment? But most people will back themselves to say that there's an application which gives you, if you like, on paper, the ability to assess someone. There's a tenant check through the credit bureau, which gives you, or through Equifax, which gives you access to the National Tenancy Database and gives you, if you like, a third-party insight. And then there's a whole range of, I guess you call judgments that come from reference checks through referees provided and through meeting that person. And it's triangulating between those 3 points, which it's not intended to be a 10-hour exercise of, you're not assessing this person for a loan, but at the same time, there is a little bit of credit risk that's established when you have a tenant. And in actual fact, you should do a little bit of due diligence, but it can be done fairly quickly. And I would guess that all of your viewers would feel pretty confident that they've got a really good sense of people they're in a position where they can make a pretty sensible judgment call.
Now, obviously, when it comes to sort of digital alternatives to the real world, there's always a cost variation that gives you a competitive advantage. So if you look at the typical cost that someone would pay using an agent versus your system, what would be the variation in cost?
Yes, so we typically, and we've actually got a calculator on the website, but we typically go with a number of around $2,000 a year per property, which takes into account obviously what percentage or the average percentage, and depending on where in the country you are, that's going to vary. But what are your percentage of management fees? What are the extra fees for finding a tenant? And what are the actual, if you like, administration costs on top of that? And obviously, if you looked over the lifetime of a property, and if you've got multiple properties, it adds up pretty quickly. So, the two things that we typically see our customers coming to us for are, number one, they want to save money, and number two, they want to take control. And the two are quite tightly linked. If you take control, you're likely to save money, and vice versa. If you save money and manage it yourself, you're likely to have more control.
Okay. So obviously, you got a pretty good handle on the customers who really like the service. What is the typical customer who's going to be trouble for you, and they will find the whole experience difficult for them?
Well, that's a great question, because when you think about, if you like, any sort of new fintech or any great new app that you've heard in the market, and technology businesses that are going sort of gangbusters, you typically think of an audience that's driven around millennials and fast adoption of technology. And if you then were to look at the stats, and you can look at ATO stats, or there's a range of other sources on this, but who owns investment or rental properties in this country? And you're going to find that 60 to 70% of that cohort are actually people that are 45 plus. And in fact, if you do some sub-segmentation, you'll find that there's an even higher percentage in the 60 plus category. So from our business perspective, when we started, we actually thought it would be the young professionals who are buying into the market, who want a new tech solution. And what we've actually found over time is it's actually the sort of either pre-retirement or early retirement segment, and it's very skewed towards the 50 plus age bracket, who own the property, and actually who are the ones who have been around and seen what a property manager who might be sort of 19, 20 years old and not necessarily taken the full care of their property, or who have a bit more time on their hands and want to look towards their retirement income and protect a little bit. So in actual fact, and we work really hard on this, and we'll often sort of use it as the guiding principle for design, is, how would mum or dad look at this and be able to use the system and easily follow the cues and clues along the way? So from our perspective, we actually work really hard and do not see the technology, so to speak, as a barrier. So when it comes to troublesome customers, I'm tempted to answer that we actually don't see too many of them, because the goal has been to find someone who is determined to, if you like, take the first step and take some action and ownership over this. And therefore, the platform sort of takes you through it from there. And, we pride ourselves on delivering an excellent level of service, and you'd see reviews of that in the public domain. So we're always here to help if someone, if technology perhaps is a concern for people.
Well, Jeremy, a great idea. Good luck with it. And let's hope you become an Airbnb of the future. Huh?
Thank you very much. I hope so.
Cheers.